Hello people! Yes, I'm back, and this time I'm doing something just a little bit different to what I've been doing recently, and by recently I mean the best part of a year. Yep, I'm going down that rabbit hole, the top whatever games of all time lists, and since today marks the 40th anniversary of the Famicom's launch, I figure why not take a look at the best games on the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System. But I've decided to limit things a bit for the selection criteria, because there were just way too many games to choose from. I was like, you know, I could do a top 100 of just every game on the system, but I'd probably have to make about, like, 50 to 100 painful cuts from that list. So I'm like, you know what, let's just limit it to the stuff that came in the first half of the console's run. The 80s. Since the console launched in 1983, and lasted through to around about 1995, at least in terms of official releases. The system has never fully died, per se. Famiclones and re-releases and ports and everything else have kind of kept the system alive over the years, and of course that's to say nothing about the Nintendo Switch Online service. But enough waffle, let's get to the topic at hand, the list itself. Now, even narrowing the selection criteria quite a bit, I still had to make quite a lot of cuts for this list, and I will mention them as the video goes on, trust me on that. So I need to point out a few things before I begin proper. Firstly, this list is made by me, as in the list was curated by me, made entirely by me, based entirely on my experiences with the games. Of course, I have not played every game on the system. There are probably some good games on the system that I've simply never touched, or maybe played for 5 minutes and then moved on to something else and just never fully appreciated. Keep in mind, I work a full-time job, I only have so much time to be able to do this sort of thing. And because there were so many cuts I had to make for this list, I also had to invoke a rule that I'm only going to include one game from each series. So you're not going to find like Mario 1, 2 and 3 on this list, for instance. I could have done that, but I decided against it because, well, I wanted to show off some of the more obscure offerings that maybe people have overlooked over the years, or that maybe deserve some kind of reappraisal, at least in my opinion. You also have to bear in mind that because this list is made entirely by myself, there's going to be a lot of bias running through the list, and in this case it's going to be action games, arcade games, or certainly games in those styles, because that's just what I'm into most. So for those of you who are really into turn-based RPGs or those Koei strategy games or whatever else, I apologise in advance. So with that in mind, let's get on to the list itself. And what better way to kick off the list than with a good old Konami game? Yes, a reimagining of Gyrus, their classic 1983 shoot-'em-up, which was brought over to the Famicom Disk System in 1988, and to the NES in the early months of 1989. It's a really good conversion. Now, for the record, I'm not going to be featuring Famicom Disk System games themselves, and for what it's worth, I do think that version of the game is a little bit superior just for being able to use the Famicom Disk System's sound channel. Now, most of Konami's arcade conversions seem to be pretty contemporary, you know, released 1 or 2 years after the arcade version debuted, but Gyrus came out during the golden years of the arcade boom, and it's interesting to see them release a NES game at this time, like in 1985 maybe, but not 1989. And it's a really good version too. It's hard to say whether this is a port of the arcade game or some kind of weird sequel that isn't labelled as such. It adds a lot of content that you just didn't get in the arcade version. You've got more variation in the levels, like you get levels where you have to destroy a bunch of things in the middle that spit objects at you. A little bit like Tempest, I guess, but not quite. And you've also got full-on boss fights. It's a really nice way to bring an arcade classic into the peak years of the 8-bit console wars. Next up, yeah, good old Excitebike. What would a list like this be without at least a few of the classic early Nintendo titles? Admittedly, there are only going to be a few pre-Super Mario Bros. Titles on this. Honestly, many of those titles don't particularly stand out, but Excitebike is one of my favourites. It provides a pretty good challenge, and the tracks themselves provide a nice range of difficulty. I mean, you've got the beginner tracks, which are really there more for you to warm up, and the later tracks are just downright evil, certainly with those time limits. You really have to practice on those quite well to have any chance of qualifying. I think my favourite part of this game is Mode B, where the game adds a whole bunch of other riders into the game where you have to try not to crash into them, though you can sometimes crash into them and just make them fall off their bike, which is always hilarious. Nowadays people will probably recognise this game as that one track from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and to be fair, that track is great, it's probably my favourite track in that game. But there is more to Excitebike than just that. The original NES games are classic, and if you want to get into some of the early Famicom and NES games, then this is one of the ones I recommend trying out. Next up is Saycross. Now those of you who've seen my previous videos may have seen this one coming. I have talked about this game before, and I called it one of the best games that didn't use some kind of custom mapper chip, which of course is most games on the console, but there you are. Saycross is one that tends to get overlooked a little, I think. Like, yeah, the arcade version did get re-released on the Switch eShop, but it's not one that anyone ever seems to talk about, and that is kind of a shame. It's actually one of the most fun shooters of its time, with just a lot of weirdness going on, like having to rescue dudes, the fact that you're just racing on a bike that shoots lasers, the cool gun power-ups, and that bizarre soundtrack that I just kind of love. Saycross to me is one of the standout shooters from the early days of the Famicom, and I recommend checking it out. Now, you may have noticed a bit of a theme going on with this list so far, which is simplistic arcade action-style games. Indeed, there are going to be quite a lot of those on this list, because personal bias and all that, I didn't choose these games based on merit, I chose them based purely on how much I like them. But here's something a bit different. Good old Deja Vu, one of the classic MacVenture games, originally by ICOM and ported to the NES by Kemco. Now what's interesting is that it seems that the MacVenture games are somewhat infamous in Japan. Shadowgate in particular is considered one of the worst Famicom games over there, which is kind of a shame because I actually really quite like the NES version. I could have easily featured that game on the list, but I decided to give the edge to Deja Vu, since there's just more in the way of plot. That's not to say that the plot is revolutionary or anything, you know, you're trying to recover from amnesia, and figure out who you are, and exactly what this murder case is that you're involved with. It's all about trying to get evidence while not getting killed, and also making sure you have enough evidence so that you don't get sent to prison for being wrongfully accused of murder. It's fairly simple stuff, but it wasn't really something you tended to find on the NES at the time. Now, yes, I am aware that the NES version of this game was released in 1990, but the original Famicom version was released in 1988, and other than the translation and a few bits of censorship here and there, they are largely the same game, so I decided to count both versions for this list. Now, what really makes Deja Vu is the script. A good adventure game needs some good flavour text, like examining just various random items that you have, and also just the interesting ways in which you can die. And it's always quite fun trying to negotiate your way out of getting shot, only for that to kind of backfire. Like, that is really what makes a game like this for me, usually. So, yeah, Deja Vu. I don't really have a whole lot more I can say about this game without spoiling the plot, so I would say judge based on what I've said, and maybe some of the gameplay here. If you like this sort of game, you might get a kick out of this one. Okay, here's a bit of a weird one for this list. Gotcha the Sport! Yeah, I wanted to feature at least one light gun game on the list because I love the light gun. I mean, sure, it's a relic of its time, CRT TVs aren't really being made anymore, LCD and plasma screens aren't really made for them, and even some of the later widescreen CRTs don't really work with them, and I find that to be really sad because, as it turns out, the NES has some very good light gun games. Gotcha the Sport is probably my favourite, which I don't know if this game really has any sort of reputation, but I imagine the fact that it was published by LJN put a lot of people off. LJN have a reputation as possibly the single most infamous publisher on the system. I don't think it's entirely fair. I think that reputation mostly comes from their awful Back to the Future and X-Men games, but Gotcha the Sport shows that LJN did actually have some pretty good games in their arsenal, and I do think it's my favourite light gun game on the console. It's a bit like the gang mode from Wild Gunman, but there's more to it. It's a game of capture the flag, in which you have to go from one end of the stage to the other, get the flag, make sure the opponent doesn't steal your flag, and make it to the end of the level in time. I think one thing that really adds a lot to this game is the difficulties. Like, beginner mode is nice if you just want to practice, but if you really want a challenge, then I highly suggest picking the expert mode, where you get like 1 or 2 seconds to shoot the enemies after they appear on screen. On beginner mode, you can often just scroll them off the screen and not worry about getting hit, but that is definitely not the case on expert. Also, is it just me or does this music sound very familiar? And now you're saying, well, it probably is deja vu? Well, it probably is deja vu, it sounds like it. Like, yes, the game only has 3 levels that loop endlessly and get a little bit harder each time, and it can be somewhat difficult to play using both the D-pad and the light gun. In fact, this might be the only game that's best played with one of those weird Nintendo 64 controller rip-offs. But regardless of all that, if I was to pull my light gun out and play some games, I will always go for a nice round of Gotcha the Sport. While we're on the subject of righting wrongs with regards to LJN's reputation, let's try to do the same for Milan's Secret Castle. Now, this game is actually pretty well regarded in Japan. It was seen as one of the better games of 1986 from what I understand, and yet in the rest of the world it's kind of infamous. And yet, in the rest of the world, it's infamous for being obtuse and not especially playable. Like, yeah, there is some level of obtuseness, but firstly, that was the standard back then. Tons of games were taking inspiration from the Tower of Draga and Super Mario Bros. With hidden items and, in Draga's case, obtuse methods to make progression in the game. But Milan's Secret Castle is actually pretty forgiving. Like, you have a continue code that you can use an infinite number of times. You actually get quite a few items that improve your abilities throughout the game. You're not very powerful at the start, but as you go through the game, you definitely become more versatile in terms of what you're actually able to do. And it's one of those games that does feel rewarding when you're able to make some progression in the game and get some cool items, like spring shoes or maybe that other item that allows you to shrink. I think there's a lot more to Milan's Secret Castle than people realise, and I do get the feeling that if people had spent more time on this game, it would not have the reputation it does. The intricate level designs and hidden items, they really do add something to the game, and it's one of those games where it's just really fun to explore all the different rooms to try to locate the items. I understand that that type of gameplay isn't going to appeal to everyone, but if it sounds fun to you, then I highly recommend checking it out and trying to stick it out for that first area to see what the game has to offer. So here's a fun fact. Did you know that Color Dreams actually made a good game? Like, that actually happened. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Color Dreams were secretly some unsung heroes that deserve recognition or anything. Honestly, their reputation as one of the worst game developers on the NES is largely deserved, because many of their games were actively terrible. And yet at the same time, this game exists. See, one of my personal favourite Commodore 64 games is Boulder Dash. So I was ecstatic to find out that the NES had a game that was basically, what if Boulder Dash, but you have a gun and some dynamite? And I do wonder if Color Dreams had missed their calling with puzzle games. They were certainly far better at this than they were with, well, platforming beat-em-ups, which, yeah, those were just kind of a disaster. Admittedly, there's not a whole lot to say about the game itself. I mean, if you've ever played Boulder Dash or a game like it before, you'll know exactly how this game works. Collect crystals, try not to get killed by the many enemies on screen. That's about it. But like I said, it's surprisingly really good. In fact, the game was so good that Color Dreams even produced a sequel for the Atari Lynx. And like I say, Crystal Mines, great game. Okay, so here we've got the first Capcom game on the list, and it certainly will not be the last. But it's kind of funny because Legendary Wings is not a game that anyone ever seems to think of as one of their classics. It is one of my favourites though. The strange thing about this one in particular is that it was never released in Japan. Maybe Capcom was worried about flooding the market with shooters. They did release a few others that same year, and there was also the game Titan Warriors, which ended up getting cancelled entirely. For whatever reason, only Americans ever got to enjoy Legendary Wings, and the rest of the world really missed out on this one. It stands out for being one of the few shooters on the console that actually has a co-op mode, and that I think adds a lot to the game. There is a little bit of slowdown, but not as badly as some other shooters I've seen from around this time, and the core gameplay is just a lot of fun. You also get a mixture of horizontal and vertical scrolling sections. It's similar to Life Force, but I find this game to be less brutal in terms of difficulty, and I enjoy it a fair bit more as a result. What really defines Legendary Wings, though, is the Lucky and Danger areas, the former being a series of bonus areas similar to those overhead sections in Bionic Commando where you can farm for continues, and you'll probably need those in order to actually beat the game. And then you have the Danger areas, which feature a bunch of enemies in this mini-boss area. But these areas do add quite a bit to the game. If I have one real issue with the game, it's that it's more repetitive than it could be in areas. The main bosses become a little bit more difficult on each level, but they are the same basic boss every time, and I do think that maybe a little bit more variation could have been done there. But regardless, it's still one of my personal favourite shooters on the console. Okay, now here's one that I think most people will be familiar with already. Now, in the pantheon of Golden Era arcade games, Marble Madness holds up as one of the big names, and for good reason. It had a novel use of the trackball to make it feel like you were physically controlling an actual marble, and for being such a short game, the game is also really difficult, or I certainly find it to be that way at least. Now, Marble Madness is a game that is difficult to convert to a D-pad. Like I said, the game made a novel use of the trackball, and of course the NES didn't have a trackball, so it had to make use of just a standard controller. And for what it's worth, Rare did an excellent job in converting the controls over, and somehow the controls feel surprisingly natural with the D-pad. The levels are more or less one-to-one with the arcade version from what I can tell, and the game just feels excellent to play. It even carries over the two-player mode from the original. It's got a lot of cool animations, though certainly that sweeping animation can be quite frustrating. And while Marble Madness might technically be one of the shortest games on the NES, I think that really kind of undersells how much time you'd probably spend with the game if you got into it. Like, yeah, you can beat the game in 5 minutes if you really know what you're doing, but it takes tons of practice to get to that point, I think. Are there better versions of Marble Madness out there? Well, maybe, but out of the console ports, it is my favourite, and if I have to play this game with a D-pad, then I am perfectly fine doing that, as long as it's this version of the game. And before we move on, I really want to highlight just how awesome the Ultimate Race music sounds in this version. Like, seriously, just listen to this. Now, I know that so far this list has primarily been more minor titles that I just happened to get into, but of course Gradius was one of the big names in the early days of the Famicom and on the NES, being released in 1986, and actually being the first game that Konami ever released on the NES, and what a way to make your debut. Now, of course the NES version of Gradius is not perfect, there is some slowdown at times, and the game is of course going to be less detailed looking than the arcade game, but that's an inevitability of the hardware. But other than that, it's a very well made conversion, and funnily enough it's also the only Gradius game that I've ever really been able to get into. I think a lot of that is just because I found this one to be just forgiving enough that I was willing to stick with the game to actually finish it. Something that I cannot say about Life Force or Gradius 2. Like, I used the lives cheat to beat Life Force, but I didn't find that to be especially fun, which is kind of the main reason I chose this game over Life Force. It doesn't have the co-op, but you know what, if I'm going to sit down and play one of these games, this is the one I'm going to choose. I just wish it was easier to skip that bloody Moai head level. Okay, so here's another one of interest, The Goonies, released in the early months of 1986 by Konami, and what I would say is possibly the turning point for Konami in terms of making console games. Up to this point, they'd just been producing simple arcade conversions, which were fine, but this was the first game that they had produced specifically for the Famicom. It's an action platformer, somewhat in the vein of Super Mario Bros., though with more of an emphasis on exploration rather than speed, and Konami really hit the ground running with this game. Like, yeah, you move a bit slow, it's not necessarily perfect, but for a game that was only released a few months after Super Mario Bros., they actually get a lot right. And I love the more exploration-focused nature of the levels. Now, for those who were turned off by the more cryptic design of something like Myland Secret Castle or certainly Super Pitfall, to be fair, the game design is fairly rudimentary. Collect keys, blow up doors, rescue the Goonies, and try not to get killed. But what makes this game as good as it is are the level designs, which start off small but become more expansive as you progress through the game. But they never become too sprawling or cryptic to navigate. It is kind of like you're just navigating your way through a series of caves, and wherever I'm going it always feels like I'm making some sort of progress towards an end goal. The main challenge comes from simply not dying to the Fratellis and the various rat things in all the levels. The real shame with this game is that it never got released on the NES. Despite the fact that there was a Versus Arcade version, Konami didn't localize the game otherwise, and that I find to be a real shame. Now, I'm sure that some people prefer the Goonies too. I personally have never really spent enough time with that one to get into it, and to be fair, maybe that is the better game and I just don't realize it yet. But in any case, it is worth trying this game out. Okay, so there have probably been a few dubious picks for this list already, and this one might be the most dubious out of all of them, because games like Mile and Secret Castle definitely have their fans, but I'm not gonna lie, I struggle to find any fans of Adventures of Tom Sawyer. People tend to write this one off as kind of mediocre, and I don't know, maybe they're right on some level. Like, yeah, the graphics aren't necessarily great for 1989, the music's a bit pokey, but I don't know, there's a certain charm to them that I just don't get with most other games. Okay, admittedly, this was one of the first games I actually decided to play for the NES. Yeah, this was actually one of the first games I actually found out about on the system, so I'm probably going to have a soft spot for the game for that reason, but the game does actually have some pretty interesting ideas, such as on the first level, where you have octopuses that can shoot ink towards you. The ink could change its skin colour to blue, it could remove the ink, or it could just also kill you, depending on the situation. The game does lose points for the river raft level though, which, okay, to be fair, it's a Tom Sawyer game, you probably have to expect at least one of those, but the level itself is kind of a bit too long, I think. They could have easily split it into like 2 different levels, and I think that would have actually worked better in all honesty. And there are also just some weird ideas in the game that I appreciated, particularly the boss fights, such as on the river raft level where you fight a giant alligator at the end of the level, or in the forest level where you fight 6 monkeys that turn into a giant ape. Or better yet, on the 4th level, where you fight a series of bosses. Admittedly, most people are probably not going to like this nearly as much as I do. How do I explain it? It's kind of a similar feeling that I'd get from playing, I don't know, Atari 2600 games, or even early Famicom games. Like, you know, playing the game on a CRT in the middle of the night with the glow of the TV coming through. And I think that more than anything is the reason why it's on this list. Mighty Bomb Jack is another one of those early side-scrolling platformers that seems to take an influence from Super Mario Bros. And this game possibly more so than any other one on the system. I mean, not only are the titles similar, but you also go around collecting bombs, getting extra lives, getting coins, side-scrolling platform in action. Even though the game was released in the early months of 1986, I think it's fair to assume that this game took a pretty strong influence from Super Mario Bros. But at the same time, taking an influence from the best is never a bad thing. Mighty Bomb Jack is notable for being the first game that Tecmo released on the NES. The game is crushingly difficult later on, and for what it's worth, I've never got more than like 2/3 of the way into the game. It features both horizontal and vertical scrolling levels, without any noticeable graphical glitches. There were games that came out much later than this which couldn't do that. And the core gameplay is just so much fun, like just having the super high jumps, the fact that you can glide through the air, collecting all the coins and the weird power-ups, and looking for all just sort of weird bonus items and rooms. That adds a lot to the game for me. I mean, as difficult as the game is, I feel like the items at least give me some chance of maybe finishing the game one day, if I happen to find all the right ones and then don't mess it up by just crashing into enemies like an idiot. Tecmo would go on to make better games after this, but this will remain one of my personal favourites. I'd buy that for $1. Oh yes, it's time to talk about the game based on one of my all-time favourite films, RoboCop. Yeah, now RoboCop is another one of those games that doesn't have a very good reputation necessarily. I've seen multiple people say that this game is shite, and I do kind of get it, like the game is quite jank, more so than most other games that were coming out in 1989. Now you may be familiar with the term kusoge, which is of course Japanese for a shitty game, but in Japan they actually have another term to describe this particular game, dekoge, which is specifically kusoge but for Data East games. And yet, this is actually probably my favourite Data East game, and the game actually does recreate a few scenes from the film. You got a recreation of the hostage scene from the film, you also get this hilarious talking animation for a couple of the scenes. Now yes, all the jankness and dekoge qualities of the game, all of that is true. And yet despite all of that, I actually find the game to be really fun to play regardless. Why is this? Well, here's the thing about RoboCop. NES RoboCop is so powerful he can block fire with his fists. And if that isn't the reason to include the game on the list, I don't know what is. Okay, so here's another one of interest. Field combat. Now, like I said, there are only going to be a handful of pre-Super Mario Bros. Games on this list, and field combat I would say is possibly one of the most underrated out of all of them. As you might have noticed already, I tend to like weird games with unique concepts, and field combat is definitely one of those, certainly for its time at least. So, you play as a UFO and you can abduct soldiers and tanks and whatever else, and then recruit them as part of your army to take down the enemy bases. Now, of course, being a pre-Super Mario Bros. Game, there isn't necessarily a whole lot in terms of complexity, but the game offers just the right level of challenge. Like, you've got some pretty bastard enemies who will actually try to abduct your own units. You also have helicopters, which are both difficult to abduct and difficult to dodge. And while the levels are short, there is quite a bit of variety to them, with various different obstacles, such as ground that gets in the way. Yes, despite controlling a flying saucer, you apparently fly close enough to the ground to have these cliff faces get in your way. But I like these obstacles, they add to the challenge of the game, and the later levels certainly pull no punches. So yeah, I'm not exactly an expert on strategy games, but field combat is good stuff. Okay, so let me say this for the record. I'm not particularly a fan of Rare. Sure, they were a talented bunch, but a lot of their games just aren't very fun to play, if I'm being honest. And I'm not just talking about the NES, I'm also talking, like, beyond that. And yet, Wizards and Warriors is among the handful of games I do like. It's interesting because this game does not seem to be well liked nowadays, and I kind of see why. The game does have stiff controls, and you also frequently get these enemies that kind of spawn in from nowhere and will often just be able to hit you before you can land a hitting on them back. But I think what really makes this game is the extra abilities and the fact that the levels are more exploration based. Mainly you're just trying to collect gems throughout the game, but it's also about trying to collect power-ups that allow you to survive the later levels. And the game is surprisingly forgiving in places. If you die and continue, you don't actually lose power-ups or even have to restart the level, which is surprising, especially for a Rare game, and you do get infinite continues as well. So, while the game can be frustrating at times, it does feel like the kind of game that you can beat through just sheer perseverance. Now, fun fact incidentally, I have beaten many of these games before. I hadn't beaten this game prior to recording the footage for this video, however. And for the record, I actually did it while playing the Japanese version. Does anyone remember that Tom and Jerry game that I covered a little while back? Wizards and Warriors actually has a pretty similar situation to that game, in that the Famicom release is just that little bit more refined and a little bit more fun to play. While I'm thinking about it, I should probably fix that title card. That's better. It's largely the same game, except you start off with a little bit more health in the Japanese version, and the throwing daggers are actually far more useful because you can actually mash the button to just keep throwing them in front of you. Whereas in the NES version you have to wait for the dagger to go off screen before you can throw another one, which can be kind of awkward in places. It also makes the second boss way more difficult from my experience, though I was able to beat it in the NES version with some practice. It's a game that's surprisingly quite good if you can get used to the controls. The weird power-ups and intricate level designs actually do add a fair bit to the game, and it's quite good fun to this day. I'm not so sure on the sequels, mind you. Okay, now one thing that you may have noticed with this list is that I tend to be quite fond of just strange games, and Monster Party might just be the strangest, certainly on the NES anyway. So what makes this game so weird? Well, for one thing, the game was never released in Japan, despite clearly being intended for that audience. The game features a whole bunch of, like, traditional Japanese demons and all that sort of thing. And it was also designed to lampoon a whole bunch of classic horror films and such. Much of this had to be changed for the NES version that made it to retail, since they probably would have gotten sued into the ground. Though it's actually kind of surprising how little was changed for this version. It's actually surprisingly gory for a NES game. The password and intermission screens have lots of blood, and not to spoil anything, but it also has one of the most fucked up endings in 8-bit video game history. Now, the game itself is a fairly rudimentary platformer. You go around, enter boss rooms, kill the bosses, get keys, go to the next level. Fairly standard stuff, but it's done well. It's easily one of the better playing platformers, but really it's kind of the stranger facets of the game that really make this one as good as it is in my opinion. I mean seriously, in what other game do you get to smash the shit out of a giant doner kebab with a baseball bat? Like, that alone makes this game a 10 out of 10 in my book. So, I have a bit of a strange confession to make. The only Metroid game I've ever finished is the one you're looking at here. I've never beaten Metroid 2, or Super Metroid, or the Metroid Prime games, or anything like that. I probably should work on that, to be honest. And that's not to say that Metroid 1 is the best game in the series by any means. It is certainly dated in places. The controls don't work quite as well as later ones, like the fact that you can't shoot diagonally and the jumping being a bit finicky. But I also feel as though it's one of those games that gets better as you play it. Like being able to spin in midair to attack the enemies helps out a lot, as does the additional weapons that you can acquire, and of course the missiles, which are especially useful in the later areas of the game. The main reason why I love the original Metroid as much as I do is the actual level designs and just the general atmosphere of the game. You just have this big expansive map which can be tricky to navigate, and for the record, yes, I did use a map, but I also felt as if it was worth the effort to traverse the whole game to actually finish it, because there's a lot of weirdness to the maps itself. Of course, that's not to say that Metroid is a perfect game by any means. The fact that you respawn with 30 health seems kind of overly harsh. Outside of that, it's not as if there's really much grinding in the game from my experience. It's one that nowadays I would probably recommend playing through with a strategy guide and certainly a map, which is what I used for reference when I played through it a while back. It's one of those games where if you can get used to its antiquities, you'll probably have a very good time with it. Admittedly, the original Metroid is not going to be for everyone, but it is hailed as one of the classics for a reason. Oh, what's this? 2 big games in a row? You're going to be seeing more and more of them as we go through the list. River City Ransom is often hailed as one of the best beat-em-ups of its time. It's like a weird cross between the beat-em-up and RPG genres. 2 genres which I don't think we've seen any games from yet on this list. Now, when a game is based on mashing up 2 existing genres, it does have to do both of them well, and this is where River City Ransom succeeds. The core beat-em-up gameplay is just really fun, like messing around with weapons, like even being able to attack enemies with other enemies. I mean, that alone is worth the price of admission. And the RPG elements work in the game's favour too. Like, you don't start off especially strong, but you do start off strong enough to be able to deal with the early enemies in the game. And the many items that you can get do increase your stats quite a bit. Now, let me say for the record, I'm not particularly a fan of JRPGs, and much of this, especially with the earlier games in this genre, has to do with just having to just constantly grind out in order to build your stats. And it just tends to get old and just sucks the fun out of the game for me. And yet, I don't feel that with River City Ransom. It's just fun to just beat the shit out of dudes over and over, because the core gameplay is as fluid and snappy as it is. So, why isn't this game higher on the list? Well, I do have a few reservations for it. Firstly, as you've probably noticed from the video footage, the game doesn't run especially great in 2-player mode, and sadly this was a common problem with Techno's games at the time. This is also the reason why Super Dodgeball isn't on this list. As good as that game is, the slowdown and sprite flickering can be a bit much. One thing that also bugged me is the fact that you cannot turn the friendly fire off, which in my opinion makes the combat more awkward than it needs to be. Like, you're already having to deal with the enemies, but now you've also got to deal with the other player not hitting you at the same time. And yeah, you'll notice that in the 2-player footage I recorded, me and my recording partner, we kind of died a couple of times, and a lot of our hits came from each other, which is kind of awkward. Now, I am aware, having read upon this, that the Famicom version does give you the option to turn the friendly fire off. Now, my recommendation for playing through this game nowadays would be to get the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun collection, since that has an option to remove the sprite flicker and slowdown, as well as a fully translated version of the Famicom release, which does seem to be just a little bit better than the NES version that I played. Maybe if I played that version it would be a little bit higher on this list, but yeah, I have to go by the experience that I've got, so here it is. Now, here's another big name which you might not necessarily expect to find on a list like this. Bomberman is one of those games that is generally regarded as a classic, but, you know, it's also one of those games that has a huge series of similar playing games, and many of those games are generally considered to be better than this. In fact, probably most of them that aren't Bomberman Act Zero. And yet, going back and playing this game, I'm actually really surprised at just how well it's aged. It is repetitive, like you got 50 levels, and they're very similar to one another except with just different enemy types. And yet, just like River City Ransom, the core gameplay is so fun, I don't really mind the repetition. The power-ups add a lot to the game. You get a couple of the bomb upgrades early on, and it does speed up the pace of the game and make it a lot more fun to play from my experience. And the additional power-ups, such as the remote bomb and the flak jacket, they make it even more fun to play. Again, this is one of those games that's a bit slow going in the beginning, but once the game picks up, it really becomes a blast, and it's one that I highly recommend playing to this day. Oh yes, it's time to dispel one of the quote-unquote gaming truths. Yeah, see, it's commonly believed that Friday the 13th on the NES is a shitty game. Now, you might think that I'm doing this as some sort of sick joke. No, I actually really love this game. Friday the 13th is a game that I don't think gets the credit it deserves. I know that survival horror refers to a very specific type of game nowadays, but it's the best description I can think of for this one. I mean, you are trying to survive Camp Crystal Lake, and as for the horror element, well, it's Friday the 13th. Now, Friday the 13th is a game that gets a bad rap, mainly from the AVGN, and I think also just the fact that it was published by LJN. And this might actually be my favourite of LJN's games, just because how different it is to every other side-scrolling game. I mean, the main idea of the game is to, well, kill Jason while he doesn't kill the children or the playable characters. Of course, if that happens, you get the most awesome game over screen in video game history. But when it comes down to it, the whole strategy of the game is, well, trying to get better weapons to kill Jason with, since the rocks and knives just aren't really going to cut it, and that's kind of the trick to playing the game. Yes, you have to run around the map a lot and try to prevent Jason from killing people, but this is where it becomes useful to know the strengths and weaknesses of the main characters. The characters are not equal by any means. For instance, Chrissy is a far better character than Debbie just because she's much faster. And it's kind of a dick move that they make George the default character, as he's by far the worst character in the game and you do not want to start with him. Like Bomberman, I think this is one of those games that doesn't necessarily make a great first impression, but gets a lot better as you spend some time with it. And for that reason, I highly recommend playing it. Okay, this is possibly one of the most interesting shooters on the console. Dragon Spirit the New Legend is not a simple conversion of an arcade game, though Namco did make a game called Dragon Spirit. This kind of comes off more like a sequel, or a weird reformulated version of the game. It's got a surprising amount of plot for a shoot 'em up, and that's one thing that makes it stand out from just about every other shooter on the system. But even if you were to ignore the plot, just from a gameplay perspective, I think this is one of the best shooters on the system. There are some really cool power-ups, such as added firepower that gives you more dragon heads. I mean, that's pretty cool. And the game even has effectively 2 different game modes based on whether you win or lose the opening level. If you die on the opening level, you get a much easier and shorter version of the game, so if you just want to have an ending, then you can do that. Or you can really challenge yourself and play the harder version with extra levels. And the levels themselves are actually quite interesting too, with a lot of weird background obstacles and walls that can block your path and such, and the levels do feel very distinct from one another. This is a game that rarely ever seems to be talked about, and I find that to be a real shame. If you like 8-bit shooters, yeah, definitely try this one out. And while we're on the subject of classic shooters, how could I ignore 1943, one of the all-time classics? 1943 is similar to Dragon Spirit in that it appears to be a reformulated version of an existing arcade game, and 1943 stands out by adding some RPG mechanics to the game, so you can upgrade your playing stats and special weapons and all that sort of thing, and that again adds a lot to the game that you simply don't get with other versions. In fact, I would actually say this is the best version of 1943. Just because the gameplay changes just add a lot more replay value as compared to other versions. Just the weird upgrades that you can apply to your plane and locating the hidden power-ups and all that sort of thing. It makes the game so much fun to play, and even just the core shoot-'em-up action on its own is probably the best that Capcom would do on the system. Just lots of cool special weapons and big battleships that you have to take down. I think 1943 stands out as one of the most improved sequels on a console. Like, the original conversion of 1942 was just kind of an average Micronix conversion. And yet 1943 is arguably one of Capcom's best. That said, while 1942 didn't make this list, there are certainly some early NES gems that did make it, such as Kung Fu. Now, Kung Fu is arguably nowhere near as good of a game as River City Ransom. It's certainly a lot less advanced, but of course it was also one of the first in the genre. And to be fair, it's also an incredibly different type of game. I mean, for one thing, it's a pretty straightforward arcade conversion, and a very well made one too. This port was actually made by Nintendo, and it definitely shows. It's actually pretty advanced, with lots of different levels, and it features all of the content from the arcade game. Obviously it's not going to look as good because, well, the hardware just wasn't at that level, and yet it plays so well that it really doesn't matter anyway. I try to avoid including too many arcade conversions, because in many cases I would rather play the arcade versions. And yet, Kung Fu, I often do end up just gravitating to the NES version. The classic sound effects and fun bosses just make this version really fun to play. The game provides just the right level of challenge. You know, it's difficult, it might take a few tries to get to the end, but as far as early Famicom games go, Kung Fu is one of the best. Of course, that's not to say it's my favourite of the pre-Super Mario Bros. Famicom games. Indeed, here's Balloon Fight, which was effectively Nintendo and HAL's take on Joust, which I think actually kind of plays better than Joust. Certainly better than the NES version anyway. It's one of my favourites to pick out for just like a simple two-player co-op game. In my opinion, Balloon Fight is one of the best ways to kill 15 minutes on the system. The inertia, the clouds that shoot lightning, the more aggressive enemies you get on later levels, it all adds to the challenge and fun of the game. But I think my favourite thing about this game is the balloon trip mode, all about just trying to dodge sparks and the weird fishing that comes out of the bottom. And despite being as early as it is, it also features one of my favourite theme songs from any NES game. That alone makes it worth the price of admission. Oh, and while we're on the subject of classic arcade conversions, let's talk about Double Dribble is another one of those arcade conversions that took a hit graphically, but that I think actually plays better than the original. For one thing, you're not having to constantly tap a button to dribble the ball, and for another, you've also got a number of options to choose from, such as having different teams with different stats, and even being able to change the length of the game. The one thing missing from the NES version is the arcade version's legendary rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. But what really makes the game is just how well it plays. It's got the basics of the sport there. You got fouls, you got out of bounds, you've got pretty much everything that you need for a decent basketball game. What really makes Double Dribble as good as it is that it's one of those games that gets the feel of the sport just right. It's one of those games that feels natural to play. The controls are simple and easy to grasp, and it never feels like you're having to fight the game in order to win. Do you want to know what my favourite part is about Double Dribble though? It's the slam dunks. In any other basketball game, they get taken for granted, but in this game, they're treated as an event, like so much so that they get to have their own cutscenes. And I particularly love the fact that you can actually miss the slam dunks even when it's showing the cutscene, which is always kind of hilarious when the player misses. It's still one of my favourites in the genre. Okay, here's a bit of a weird pick of this list, let alone to put it this high. Okay, so Devil World is best explained as Nintendo's take on Pac-Man, starring what appears to be Bub from Bubble Bobble, though of course it predates that game by a couple of years, and also having this bizarre Christian theme going on, which might explain why the game never got an American release originally. I mean, as far as games that could have been black box titles go, this is easily one of my favourites. Like, yeah, the game is clearly a take on Pac-Man, but the game adds actually quite a lot to it, such as weird crosses that you have to collect in order to be able to collect the dots, or the level where you have to collect Bibles and bring them to the middle of the board, or even just those weird bonus levels where you have to get the boxes. Also the fact that you have the demon controlling the maze that kind of loops endlessly. Similar to Balloon Fight, this is one of those games that's one of my favourites to pull out as a co-op title, and I think that having a second player does add a lot to the game. Especially if you try to play competitively and you're just trying to get more points than the other player. Play it that way and it devolves into chaos, which is totally my thing. Admittedly, part of the reason why this game's as high on the list as it is because I love Pac-Man as much as I do. But for the record, Pac-Man is not on this list, because if I'm going to play that, I'm going to play a turbo ROM hack of it. As far as Pac-Man alternatives go on the Famicom, this one is surprisingly excellent. Oh, here we go. How do I explain this? So, yeah, the question here is not, why is The Legend of Zelda on this list? Rather, why isn't it higher on this list? Okay, I've got a bit of an odd relationship with Legend of Zelda. It's one of those series that I've always really struggled to get into at all. Like, I love Ocarina of Time as much as anyone else, but outside of that, I've always just kind of struggled with this series. Yeah, it's kind of difficult to explain, but I find these games a bit hard going at the beginning, and oftentimes I just kind of get put off by that. But I want to make it clear that I did not include this game on the list because it's popular. I include the game on this list because I like the game. I mean, I'm probably going to be branded as uncool for not including many great games that I just never got into. But while Legend of Zelda isn't my favourite game of all time, it is one of the best. And the big reason why this game is on my list is because, much like River City Ransom, the core gameplay is as fun as it is. Like, just going around the overworld screen and just smashing the shit out of a whole bunch of enemies, yeah, that never gets old. And I have played the game enough to be confident in saying that. It's definitely one of those games that I think is probably best played with the manual and the map that it comes with. Unfortunately, I don't own a physical copy of the game, and I kind of wish I did. It is one of those games that can be difficult to get into if you don't have that documentation, or at least that's how it feels from my experience. Having a map that gives you a general idea of where the dungeons are, that helps quite a bit. And for the record, while recording this footage, I wasn't actually using one at all. And this led to me forgetting where the second dungeon was and going to the third one by accident. Though this did lead to my proudest moment in any of these recording sessions, where I got to the third boss with basically no health left, and managed to beat it with a couple of lucky bomb placements. Moments like that can often just make a game for me. How can I justify including this game on the list if I've never actually beaten it? Well, I think mainly just because, like I've said, the core gameplay is as fun as it is. For me, there's a big difference between Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, which is that Zelda 1 actually makes me want to finish the game and Zelda 2 just kind of doesn't. Apologies to any Zelda 2 fans watching this video, but that's just how it is. But you know what, I do have my reservations, like the fact that you can't move or attack diagonally for the most part. I do think that's something worth griping about, and I do get the impression that those that grew up with this game at the time probably overlook some of the more dated aspects of the gameplay. But regardless of my reservations with the game, yeah, it's still one of the best. Okay, now speaking of all-time beloved classics, here's another one. Batman is often cited as one of the best platformers on the system, and one of the games that really defines Sunsoft as one of the greatest game developers for the console. I'm certainly not going to disagree with that. I mean, the fact that I placed it above Zelda should be enough to tell you that much. Now yes, you can make the case that Batman is not a great representation of the film, and that's certainly true. Like, it kind of captures the atmosphere of the film a little bit, and they do feature a couple of the lines from the film, but not a whole lot besides that. But no, the reason why Batman is so good is because it's just one of the best platformers of its time. The thing about Batman is that the game is based all around precision platforming and timing. Like, you've really got to master like where to jump, where to stand, which attacks to use at a given time. The game is designed very intricately, more so than most other games of the time I feel, and that's the reason why I love it so much. Like, it always feels as if every area was designed with a specific solution to it, and as difficult as the game is, it rarely ever feels unfair. Which is one of the big reasons why I prefer this to most of Sunsoft's other games on the system, if I'm being honest. The game is quite difficult, and I've never quite been able to finish it. Not only that, but the graphics and soundtrack are among the best on the system. So yeah, if you love 8-bit platformers and you haven't played this game yet, look, just pause the video, go and play this game, and then come back to me. Okay, it's time for a bit of change of pace. Galaga is of course one of the most widely celebrated and popular titles from the golden era of arcade games, and the Famicom conversion of the game is excellent. It keeps all the fun of the arcade game, and it just feels excellent to play in its own right. Yeah, the game itself is more or less a straight port, but when you're dealing with a game as good as Galaga, there's not really much reason to change it. I mean, seriously, the fact that you can have double ships and the bonus levels and more complicated enemy patterns. I've got to be honest, I kind of had a hard time choosing between this and Galaxian, but I do think Galaga offers a little bit more in terms of variety and replayability, so it got the edge. And as far as pre-Super Mario Bros. Games go, this is easily up there as one of my favourites. Okay, here's one that I think all of you were expecting at this point. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is one of the finest sports games of its time. Assuming that you're willing to qualify it as a sports game anyway. I've seen some people refer to this as a puzzle game, which I find quite intriguing. I can't even really disagree with that. I mean, much of the game is based around figuring out the enemy patterns and how to counter them. And I have to confess, I'm actually kind of bad at this game, and I've never been able to make it beyond the major title circuit. But admittedly, that's probably just because I haven't spent enough time with the game to learn the patterns for the later opponents. Yeah, remember what I said about just not having enough time to really be able to play some of these games in more detail? Yeah, I think that's where having a full-time job kind of becomes a problem. The opposing boxes have a surprising amount of personality for a 1987 console game, and the game just plays great. The controls are immediate and responsive, like the punching feels great, as does that special uppercut move that you can do, which is always fun when you get a chance to pull that off. I imagine that this is one that most, if not all of you, have already played, so I don't think you need another person recommending this one to you, but in the off chance that you haven't, yeah, definitely play this one. Now, while Punch-Out's status as a puzzle game classic might be a bit debatable, I don't think that's the case for Adventures of Lolo. It basically takes the gameplay of Sokoban and adds a few extra elements, such as enemies, items, power-ups, and the fact that you have to collect a bunch of hearts in order to beat the level. And those elements really make the difference between a boring game like Sokoban and an all-time classic puzzle game such as Adventures of Lolo. Now yes, Sokoban does have its fans. I obviously am not one of them, but why do I like this game and not Sokoban? What really makes this game for me is the variety. Like, you've got many different enemy types, and the level designs do change quite a bit with different obstacles. You've got water, you've got bridges, which you can occasionally build on your own, and you have the classic block pushing action that you would expect from a Sokoban style puzzle game. But out of all the games of this type, this one is definitely my favourite. Okay, so now we go from a game that some people like to a game that no one ever seems to talk about. Hinotori Ho-Oh-En Gao no Boken is a pretty early Konami platform game, which I think is actually one of their classics. The game effectively combines elements of your standard side-scrolling platformer with Solomon's Key of all games. The big gimmick of the game is being able to place blocks around, as well as being able to destroy some parts of the levels that you're on. And you know what, just being able to place blocks down to traverse the level is always fun to me. But what also makes this game stand out from other games of its time is the strange structure of the levels. You've got 16 levels spread across 4 different worlds, but here's the thing, those 4 worlds actually loop in on themselves, and you actually have to explore the levels quite a bit in order to find hidden doors that allow you to access the other worlds in the game. And the game definitely puts up a decent challenge, with quite a few different enemy types, and some of them which are actually quite difficult to avoid consistently. People tend to dismiss this as one of the weaker Konami games of its time, and I don't know if I'm just biased because I like the Solomon's Key-esque gameplay. The game also features quite a few different bosses too. Like, not all of the levels have a boss at the end, but there are quite a few different types. Sometimes it helps to use the blocks to your advantage in order to be able to reach the boss easier. Sometimes you can just spam shots and kill them that way. And yeah, admittedly the bosses are not the best designed ones in the world. Like I say, often you can just spam shots and win, but the level designs are quite fun, as are some of the power-ups, like invincibility and being able to just pass through walls. Like I say, this is one that I think deserves a bit more attention than it gets, and it's one of my personal favourite Konami games of the time. Speaking of games no one talks about, how about Zexes? It's kind of a shame, as it's one of my personal favourite side-scrolling platformers on the console. Now, gameplay-wise, it's kind of like a weird mix of a platformer and a shoot-'em-up. Like, most of the time you're just spent walking around doing fairly rudimentary platforming, and then you get plenty of shoot-'em-up sequences mixed in. But there's more to the gameplay than your average platformer of the time. Like, you've got tons of side areas that contain shops or bonus games, or weapons that you might need to beat the level. Now, the additional weapons that you get don't necessarily start off great, but the weapons do become far better as you progress through the game, and it is worth making it to those later levels just with the satisfaction of being able to use those better weapons. And also just being able to glide through the air is also cool. And some of the side areas are just plain weird, like the rooms where you have to fight a boss in order to save a girl in a bathtub. Yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on with that one. It is worth noting that the game is actually a localized version of the Famicom game Kame no Ongeishi Urashima Densetsu, which was originally a take on the Japanese fairy tale Urashima Taro, which might explain why the character's riding a turtle in space on the title screen. Yeah, it's kind of a leftover from that concept. And so the game ends up being like this bizarre mix of sci-fi and Japanese fairy tales. Kind of like how Monster Party was like a weird mix of Japanese and Western horror culture. The controls aren't necessarily the best on the system, but the platforming is quite fun regardless, and there is quite a lot to do in the game. It's one of my personal favourite side-scrolling platformers on the console. Okay, here's a game that I think needs no introduction, and yet it gets one of the best ones anyway. Akumajo Densetsu, or Castlevania 3 if you prefer, is commonly regarded as one of the best games on the system, and rightfully so. I've got to be honest, I actually had a hard time picking between this and Castlevania 1 for the list. Either of those games easily could have been here, but I decided to go for Castlevania 3 for a couple of reasons. It has arguably the greatest soundtrack on the console, tons of levels, lots of different abilities, and tons of interesting level gimmicks and bosses too. But I think the big reason why I prefer Castlevania 3 is the extra playable characters. Because the extra characters are just so much fun to play as, like having an infinite supply of daggers and being able to climb on walls and ceilings is always fun to do, or hell, just being able to turn into a bat and fly around the stage. Stuff that you just couldn't do in the first one. So, if I love the game as much as I do, why isn't Castlevania 3 even higher on the list? Well, I do have one big reservation with the early Castlevania games, and that is the controls. I've always found the early Castlevania games to have stiff controls, even for the time. I'm not gonna lie, the controls can make it difficult to go back to this game after playing Symphony of the Night, and it's one of those games where I have to be in a mood where I'm willing to put up with the controls. Like, it's not just because of games like Symphony of the Night that tighten the controls a lot after this, but also many other platformers that were coming out around the same time, you know, games that I felt just had tighter controls and were just generally more fun to play around with. Your mileage may vary on this. Like I say, I do still love this game. Castlevania 3 is one of those games that isn't quite perfection, but yeah, it gets pretty close to it. Yeah, suffice to say, much of the remainder of this list is going to be the big hitter titles, such as Zanak, or possibly Zanak AI, whatever you want to call this game. Now, Zanak is commonly cited as one of the all-time greatest shooters on the NES. It has to be said, for a game released in 1986, it feels surprisingly ahead of its time. I mean, the backgrounds look amazing for the time. And you've also got just tons of great power-ups too. 8 different types of weapons, which are generally really fun to play around with, and using the different weapons actually requires you to play the game very differently. And the game also has very adaptive AI, like depending on the weapons you have, the game might actually become a lot harder. It's similar to Gradius or Xevious in that sense, but I do feel as if there's a bit more going on under the hood with this game. This, I feel, was the start of Compile's run of amazing 8-bit and 16-bit shoot-em-ups. I wouldn't quite call it the best of them. They would certainly reach even bigger highs with the 16-bit entries of the Aleste series, but if you want to play an all-time classic NES shooter, this is one of the best. Okay, so full disclosure, when I first started brainstorming ideas for this video, one of the first things I did was make a draft top 50 list. And there were certainly quite a few titles near the bottom end of that list, which were games that I don't feel quite as strongly about as the ones near the top end, and also games that I might not have just gotten into enough to be fully confident in my opinion on the game. Some of those games, of course, did not make the cut. And then there's Wing of Medulla, a game that I actually grew to like far more than I already did. Wing of Medulla is one of those games that I wanted to get into, but was never quite able to do it. I always found the beginning stages a little bit too difficult, and then I sat down and actually made it past those first few levels, and that was when the game really got good. Like, Wing of Medulla is another one of those games that does not make a great first impression. I do think that the game starts off a little bit too difficult, and you're not very powerful at the beginning. But what really makes Wing of Medulla is that you get tons of power-ups across the game, which upgrade your sword and your mobility and give you a whole load of magic powers. It's one of those games where you just feel far more powerful as you progress, and there's a huge sense of satisfaction in this game as you get towards that point. It might take some perseverance near the beginning to get to that point, but it is totally worth it. The levels can be difficult to navigate, but they are never too cryptic from my experience, and the controls are surprisingly tight. One of Sunsoft's earliest games for the system, and the prevailing wisdom I've seen online is that Sunsoft's games before Blaster Master weren't very good, which I don't believe in at all. Yeah, the games generally weren't as definitive as Blaster Master, but they were variable in quality. Sure, there were some abominations like Atlantis No Naso or Super Arabian, but then you had games like Route 16 Turbo, which were perfectly fine, and then you have Wing of Medulla, a game that looks amazing for 1986, and also has a really good soundtrack. I mean, seriously, just listen to this. Wing of Medulla is definitely a window into the type of games that Sunsoft would go on to produce, but as beloved as many of those games are, this one might actually be my favourite. Like I say, that whole sense of just becoming more powerful as you progress through the game, that's really what makes this game as good as it is for me, and it is for this reason that I place it this high on the list. Okay, so what kind of list would be complete without a bit of Tetris? Now Tetris is one of my all-time favourite puzzle games because, well, it's Tetris. Now the interesting thing about Tetris is that there were 3 different versions of it released across the Famicom and the NES. If I'm going to play any of these games, I'm going to play the Tengen version. So why is the Tengen version better than the others? Well, part of it is I just like the presentation a bit more. Tetris has rarely ever been a looker, but the Tengen version is definitely the best looking. It's more colourful than the other versions, and it just got a nice clean look to it, which I appreciate. But the main thing that makes the Tengen version as good as it is the 2-player modes, where you get to play against the other player, or more interestingly, actually cooperate with them to try to survive for as long as possible. A mode which I don't recall seeing in any other Tetris games, and that's kind of a shame. It's certainly one of the highlights of this version. It's just kind of weird when you're trying to cooperate with either the computer or the other player. It certainly has a much better dynamic than other Tetris games at the time, where it boiled down to just 2 people playing 2 separate games of Tetris at the same time. The Tetris games would certainly become more refined over time, with the hold a piece mechanic and extra 2-player modes and all this sort of thing, but if I want to play an early iteration of Tetris, I am always going to go for the Tengen version. Now, speaking about all-time beloved classics, Bionic Commando is quite simply one of the best side-scrolling platformers on the system, and it somehow manages to do it without a jump button, which is interesting. Bionic Commando is one of those games that has a certain purity to the gameplay. The game is all based around precision platforming, trying to position yourself so that you can actually make the jumps, as well as just mastering the grappling hook. And Bionic Commando is another one of those games that is technically a heavily reformulated version of an arcade game, and it is absolutely to the game's benefit. The challenge has tons of variety to it as well. You acquire a lot of different weapons and items throughout the game, you got quite a few different bosses, and trust me, the platforming gets really difficult as you progress through the game. Sometimes you've got barely any space to move around at all. And most importantly, has really solid control. This is one of those games where in order to pull it off, they had to get the controls down 100%, and they absolutely mastered it. And even just outside the platforming, there's quite a bit going on. You got those overhead bonus areas where you can get continues. Again, if you're actually going to sit down and beat this game, you'll probably need those. And then you've also got the neutral areas, which give you various extra items, which you may or may not need to beat the game. So yeah, Bionic Commando, one of the best platformers on the system. Go play it. You know how I was talking about how I had to make a lot of painful cuts just to make a top 50 for this video? Yeah, I also had to make a lot of painful cuts in my top 10. Konami were one of the masters of 8-bit action games, and Jackal is one of their best. Awesome 2-player co-op overhead shooter action. Yeah, can't go wrong with that. With lots of fun environments and cool music, all those cool missile power-ups, and some really interesting bosses thrown in as well. The game is also surprisingly a lot better than the original Famicom Disk System version, which is missing the first level, and also the remaining levels are only half the width of what you'll find in the final version, and yeah, suffice to say the NES got the far superior version of the game. It's another one of those games that's a great go-to for co-op action, and I highly recommend it. Okay, before I get to the top 10 proper, I do think I need to acknowledge at least a few games that didn't make the cut, because they are worth mentioning anyway. Firstly, there are a handful of great sports games that were simply overshadowed by better sports games on the same console. Ice hockey is a good example of this, as is Tecmo Bowl. I love Tecmo Bowl, but if I'm going to play an American football game on the NES, I'm always going to play the sequel. Blaster Master is another one worth highlighting. This one I think is almost great, but it just barely misses the mark. It has great presentation, pretty decent controls, a cool mix of overhead and side-scrolling areas, lots of exploration, and some interestingly designed bosses. So why isn't this game on the list? Well, Blaster Master is not a short game, and they expect you to beat this entire game in one sitting, with no passwords or save features, and they even limit continues, which seems like a bit much for a game like this to me. While I'm on the subject of platformers, I should also highlight Ninja Gaiden. I'm sure this one would be on most people's lists, but I just can't quite get there myself. It's mostly great. Again, good controls, great soundtrack, solid graphics, really cool cutscenes. The deal breaker for me really comes with that final boss, like just the fact that you have one shot to beat the whole boss, and if you die once you have to do the entire last levels again. I should also point out Lore of the West, which is one of my all-time favourite Commodore 64 games and got a Famicom port in 1987. I really wanted to include this game on the list, but I couldn't quite justify that because, honestly, the Commodore 64 version is just the better version. Not only do the graphics look a bit nicer, but you also don't have those weird gameplay changes like the addition of a score system, which seems out of place for a game like this. And also just those random dudes in the background that show up to try to shoot the person you're talking to. Like, if I'm going to shoot the person I'm talking to, I'm just going to do that myself. And finally, the magic of Scheherazade. Yeah, one thing you might have noticed with this list is a lack of RPGs. This was the game that I had intended to include on the list, because if I'm going to play any NES RPG before 1990, this is the one I'm going to play. From what I've played, it doesn't seem to have the grinding requirements of pretty much any other game from the genre of the time. It's got some pretty good presentation, some creative writing, a cool time travel mechanic, and this bizarre mix of real-time and turn-based combat that I don't recall seeing in any other games. So why isn't this game on the list? I'm not gonna lie, I cocked up the dates. The Famicom version of this was released in 1987, but the NES version of the game is far superior, and that's the version that I would have included. I thought it was released in December 1989, but after looking up the dates, apparently it was released in January 1990, so, whoops. I know, don't look at me like that. Oh right, the top 10, here we go. So, we finally make it to the top 10, and, wait, Idle Hakenden? I'm sorry, what is this? So, it's an adventure game based on idols? I'm sorry, why is this in the top 10? That might be what you're thinking if you're not familiar with this game, but for those who've actually sat down and played it, you might be going, oh yes, he's played this one. Yeah, Idle Hakenden is a bit of a departure for this list, because, as you might have noticed, the vast majority of them have been, you know, action games. And yet, here we have what is literally an idle-based Japanese adventure game, which honestly does not sound like the sort of thing I'd be into. That's not to say I don't like Japanese adventure games. I like Princess Tomato and the Salad Kingdom. It's not on this list, because I find the gameplay in that one is just a little bit too flawed. The whole having to repeat the same actions over and over to get somewhere in the game. And yet, Idle Hakenden just doesn't really seem to have that problem, certainly not to nearly the same extent. But what really makes a game like this is the writing. Idle Hakenden is a game that stands out just for its sheer weirdness. Firstly, for those who haven't figured it out from the title, is basically the story of Satomi Hakenden as told through the perspective of an 80s budding pop idol. And I'm going to say for the record, the whole idea of idol culture kind of skews me out a bit. I mean, the idea of worshipping an actual living person just comes off the wrong way to me. And yet this game just works. The writing is often just hilarious, with these often nonsensical solutions to what are often pretty simple problems. It reminds me a little bit of like a Sierra adventure game in that sense, but of course those games you often end up getting stuck because the solutions don't make any sense, and you're having to act out the entire solution by yourself. Whereas in this game, the solutions largely play themselves out, which takes one of the most frustrating aspects of any adventure game and makes it into arguably one of the best parts of the game. And the fan translation I'm playing here is also excellent. I don't know how close it is to the original script, but the humour of the original definitely carries over to this version. I'm trying not to spoil anything here since this is a story-heavy adventure game, and I do get the feeling that most people watching this video have probably not played this one. Trust me, it is absolutely worth it. Come on now, in what other game can you have the main character sing a song to a sea otter to crack open a nut? Oh yes, now here's a very polarising one. Spelunker is one of those games that either you love or hate, and yeah, I'm probably gonna get a lot of pushback here. Like, there's no way this game is better than Bionic Commando and Jackal. Well, what can I say? I happen to like Spelunker just a little bit more. It is one of my all-time favourite platformers. For one thing, it's got one of the best theme songs of any game on the system. Not original, but just a really good song, so who really cares? And one thing that you might have noticed about me is that I do love precision-based platforming. And Spelunker for me is one of the best in this regard. With its tight controls, and the game actually gives you plenty to do, like climbing ropes, jumping from platform to platform, shooting ghosts. Like, for a 1985 game, there's a surprising amount to it. And I'm sure most people are going to disagree with this, but the Famicom NES version is by far my favourite. But it's really just the tightness of the game design that really makes this one as good as it is. I do think that the trick to getting into this game is to actually use a turbo controller. Like, getting off the ropes can be a bit of a pain at times, but using one of those actually makes it a lot more manageable. And I just love the level designs too. Like, you just have to go around and just traverse all these different little areas to it. I know a lot of people don't like how you die by falling like 5 inches down the screen, but I don't know, I've always found it kind of amusing, and it's one of those things that really isn't that bad once you're used to it. Now, I do get why some people dislike this game between the controls on the ladders and ropes and just the weird fact that you die by falling like 5 inches down the screen, and yet I always find the game to be really difficult and yet just kind of immensely fun at the same time in a way that many other overly difficult games of the time just aren't. And that is enough to get this game in my top 10. Okay, so here is a game that I'm pretty sure all of you were expecting. DuckTales is of course considered to be one of the all-time great games on the system, and rightfully so. Much like Bionic Commando, the game is fairly standard platforming for the most part, but with a couple of key differences. Firstly, you've got that sort of weird pogo bounce move, which, yeah, I'm not really sure how that works with a walking stick, but let's just go with it. And while you can certainly make the argument that the game is fairly easy, the real challenge in this one for me just comes from trying to get as much money as possible to get the best ending. And as short as the game is, there's actually quite a lot to do. The environments are actually varied quite a bit, with minecarts, bottomless pits, bridges, having to pogo on spikes in mid-air. DuckTales is one of those games that doesn't deviate from the standard platforming template too much, but where it does deviate, it absolutely pulls it off. And as if that wasn't enough, the game also has the moon theme. Need I say any more? Okay, so when we're talking about classic games from the early days of the NES, Red Racer never seems to be the first game to come to mind, and yet it's one of my all-time favourites. Part of that is that I just love a good racing game, and Red Racer is one of the best. The undulating hills and smooth turns are actually really impressive for 1987, and even many races that came after this couldn't do this. The game is really technically impressive just on that level, but the game is also just a really good solid racing game. The game takes a pretty clear influence from Outrun, in that you're essentially racing against the time just to make it to the end of the level, but there are a few differences. Firstly, the levels are all separate to one another, you don't choose the route to take or anything like that, and there are fewer areas than there are in Outrun, but the game makes up for it by being a longer game with 8 separate tracks. And the graphics are amazing for 1987, with lots of cool parallax effects and that aforementioned road effect that I was mentioning. And the challenge is just at the right level. Like, the game is fairly forgiving to begin with, easy enough to deal with turns and the cars not being too aggressive, but the game certainly becomes more difficult as it progresses. The gameplay doesn't vary that much across the whole experience, but it does vary it up enough by just making it that much more difficult on each level, with the other drivers becoming more aggressive and the tracks becoming more difficult to traverse. Red Racer is easily one of the best racing games on any 8-bit platform, and if you love Outrun, you owe it to yourself to try this game out, I think. Oh, how do I explain this one? Okay, Paperboy is a game that I'm pretty sure no one is going to agree with. No one ever looks at the NES version of Paperboy as, like, any sort of classic. No one except for me, apparently. Yes, this one is a total bias pick, I'm not going to lie about that. I want to make this clear that this is an entirely honest list, in the sense that I wanted this list to most accurately reflect my true feelings on all of these games. Is Paperboy really my 6th most liked game on the NES? Well, out of the games I had to choose from, yeah, I think it is. How? The thing about early arcade games is that they tend to have a certain zen to them. A good golden era arcade game just kind of makes you zone in on it and just forget about the world around you, which escapism is definitely one of the big reasons why I enjoy playing games as much as I do. And Paperboy is one of those games that reminds me why I love playing games as much as I do. Just sitting down to play this for like a good 15 minutes. For me, it's got a similar appeal as something like Marble Madness. Yeah, it's short, but it took a lot of practice to get to the point of actually being able to beat the game. And I don't know what to tell you, that soundtrack is just amazing. Now, I know I've said this before in a previous video, but I think it deserves repeating. You could easily make the case that there are better versions of this game. And yet at the same time, the NES version of Paperboy is the only one I've ever liked. Why is that? Well, it pretty much all comes down to the controls. The original arcade game had a pair of handlebars that you used for analog controls, and while that was certainly quite interesting for the original arcade release, I'm not particularly a fan of how most of the home versions controlled. It's like they tried to replicate the analog feel of them by adding a whole load of inertia to the turns and whatever. I wasn't particularly a fan. It just kind of felt awkward to play them. You can say the Mega Drive version of this is better, but I just never liked how it controlled. And the NES version's purely digital controls do a lot more for me. They're just far more snappy and immediate, and I much prefer that. And Paperboy for me provides just the right level of challenge. It's difficult, it took me many years to master it and eventually be able to finish the game. And yet, while practicing the game to get to that point, I was always just having immense fun while playing it. So yeah, that's why this game is up here. Don't agree with my placement? Tough. Okay, so now we've made it to the top 5, and now it's really time to get down to the all-time indisputable greats of the console. Yeah, it's mostly going to be big hitters from here on out. Now, of course, Mega Man 1 is an all-time classic, and one of the games that really raised the bar for the platformer genre. But as big and revolutionary as Mega Man was, Mega Man 2 is a contender for the single best sequel on the console. Why is Mega Man 2 so great? Primarily it's because the game just adds a load of extra features that just makes it play better than the original. Like, you've got more weapons, you've also got extra platforming items that allow you to traverse the levels a bit easier, you got a ton of awesome bosses, one of the best soundtracks on the console, as well as some of the best graphics that 1988 has to offer. And of course, the E-tanks, which certainly help on the later levels, and I kind of wish were in the first game, but what are you going to do? And while this game doesn't necessarily need more people heaping praise on it, at the same time, this list just wouldn't be complete without this game. Okay, so here's a bit of a weird pick for the top 10. Again, this is one that most people probably aren't going to agree with. Rygar is an interesting one because this is actually one of the very first heavily reformulated takes on an arcade game. The original arcade Rygar was a decent enough side-scroller for its time, but also very repetitive, and not one that I feel the need to play for more than 10 minutes at a time. But the NES game basically takes what was a decent enough arcade game and basically expands it to be one of the first truly great Metroidvanias, I think. Metroid is a great game, but it's one that can be rough going at times, and that's not so much the case for Rygar, which I think actually holds up even better. The game has a lot of these nice detailed backgrounds, an overhead area, a nice atmospheric soundtrack, which was actually not all that common on the NES from my experience. You're stuck with a melee weapon for the game, but it actually has a surprising amount of range to it once you upgrade it. It's similar to Zelda in the sense that it can just be fun going around killing enemies, increasing your health and attack power, as well as just farming for power-ups as you need them. You also get some interesting bosses, which actually vary quite a bit in difficulty. Like, the first boss, for instance, is actually one of the more difficult bosses in the game, oddly enough. And there's quite a bit of variation to the level designs too. Sometimes you have to do quite a bit of exploring to find the next part of the game. Other times it's just a simple gauntlet to get from point A to point B. I think that Rygar is a game that any Metroidvania fan owes it to themselves to check out and to try to play through at least once. Even though the game largely plays out the same every time, it's actually one that I've played through on several occasions just because I just enjoy it that much. Okay, now here's one that I think everyone was expecting. A list like this just would not be complete without Super Mario Bros. It's also probably not complete without several games that aren't on this list, but of course Super Mario Bros. Is the game that basically changed the face of 2D side-scrolling platformer games forever, as well as just the landscape of console games as we know it, quite possibly. But while all of that is arguably true, yeah, the reason why it's on this list is because, well, Super Mario Bros. Is simply that good. Nintendo basically created this to be kind of the ultimate video game, and you know what, if this was the last game ever made, it sure would have been a great one to go out on. Now you might be wondering, why did I include Super Mario Bros. 1 and not Mario 2 or 3? Now, my experience of Mario in my youth did not come on the NES. It actually came firstly on the 16-bit consoles with Super Mario All-Stars, which is a great compilation, but funnily enough, about 90% of my memories with that compilation actually specifically come with Super Mario Bros. 2. I loved playing that game back in the day, and I still do to this day. So why didn't I choose that game over the original? Well, as much as I love Mario 2, yeah, my love of that comes with the 16-bit version. And the same is also kind of true for Mario 3. Like, the NES versions of both games are all-time classics, but at the same time, if I was given the choice, I would pick the SNES versions of those games any day. But my experience of Super Mario Bros. 1 was very different. While I did play it on Super Mario All-Stars as a kid, my memories with this one actually come from the Game Boy Advance, where it was ported to that system as Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. And it was an amazing port. Not only was it just a great port of the original game, but it also added tons of extra features like time trials, challenges, You vs. Boo, Game Boy printer functionality, weird tarot card features and all that sort of thing. Yeah, there was a lot to unpack with that one. It was a great port. And yet, if I was going to choose any version of Super Mario Bros. To play nowadays, it would be the NES original. Because, as much as I love the Game Boy version, the cropped screen can make it a bit awkward to play at times. What more is there to say about a game that's so popular that it's had multiple films based on it? Not a whole lot. And yet, it's only at number 3 on this list. So what could possibly be better than the ultimate video game?
Blades of Steel.
And if there was ever a name that deserved such an awesome title, it was this one. Blades of Steel is Konami at their best. Double Dribble was certainly a great game, but Blades of Steel came out over a year later, and it's on a whole nother level. How come? Well, the presentation definitely took a step up, with a big lively audience, that TV that shows up whenever you score, and for an arcade ice hockey game, there's a surprising amount going on. Sure, you've got just the standard ice hockey action itself. One reason why I love Blades of Steel as much as I do is that it's an arcade sports game that knows it's an arcade sports game. Like, it plays pretty fast and loose with the rules of ice hockey, and it's always done to add to the fun of the gameplay. You don't need offsides, but do you think this is a simulation? The game certainly plays fast and loose with the rules of hockey, and I'm sure there are some purists of the sport who might complain, but you know, if it makes the gameplay more fun, then I'm all for it. I think my favourite thing about Blades of Steel, however, is the added little touches to the game, like those one-on-one fight sequences that break out that also give you a power play if you win them. The penalty shootouts, a full-fledged playoff system, which definitely adds a lot of replayability to the game, especially if you're trying to play on the pro mode. I could never beat the game on that level, and certainly not for lack of trying. Hell, you could shoot the fucking core from Gradius in the middle of it. What more do you need? And yet, despite being one of the best games on the console, it wasn't even the best game Konami released that year. And that brings us to our number 1 pick. Yes, that's right. The one you've all been waiting for, the indisputable, all-time legendary classic, Tetsuwan. Oh, sorry, I got the wrong game on screen. Actually, it's this one. I mean, come on now. What did you think was going to be at the number 1 spot? Blades of Steel might be one of the greatest sports games of all time, but Contra is just one of the best games of all time, regardless of genre or console. Contra for the NES takes what was already a pretty good arcade game and makes it even better. One of the big reasons why I chose games for this list was that they managed to nail a certain feel, none more so than Contra. Playing Contra is like a fact of life. In fact, there's only one thing better than the NES version of Contra, and that's the Famicom version. Yeah, did you know that the Famicom version includes an in-game story and more detailed graphics? It's kind of amazing that what I consider to be the best NES game of all time isn't even the best version of itself. Like, the Famicom version of Contra, to me, basically perfected the run-and-gun genre. Now, there are tons of great run-and-gun games out there, but in my opinion, the original Contra nailed it perfectly. There are certainly quite a few contenders for the best run-and-gun games of all time. You know, Gunstar Heroes, Metal Slug, Contra Hard Corps maybe, but for me, Konami got it perfectly the first time around, with amazing varied level designs, cool changes to the gameplay, interesting stage hazards, enemies that become smarter as you progress through the game, lots of cool bosses, and it's the ideal co-op game too. As far as I'm concerned, to me, Contra is the Famicom. This is the game that really defines the console for me, more so than Super Mario Bros. Or Mega Man or Legend of Zelda. For me, this game is the NES, and there will never be another game like it. So, what does this list say about me and the NES? Well, it probably suggests that I waste a lot of time playing old NES games that no one actually cares about, but when the games are this good, is it really wasted time? Because I think it's time that's pretty well spent. In any case, I think it's time to roll the credits because this video has gone on long enough, so ta-ra!